What is going on, guys? DragonTamerBlayde here, back from our Elder Scrolls Legends, and today, we got news yesterday on Friday. Today is Saturday. We got news yesterday that there is a balance patch coming earlier than anticipated. Originally, it was supposed to be not until mid to later August after the client launched, but we're actually going to get one sooner. So we're going to go ahead and talk about some of those changes today, what I think about them, what effects I think they'll have on the game, you know, just in case you guys don't follow Twitter or Reddit or whatever. I know there's a lot of you that don't. You might not have seen the announcement, so I guess this could be your way of seeing what the changes will be. So I'm going to pull up the Elder Scrolls Legends website over here, and let's take a look at it. So the first card that they are nerfing, not a surprise at all, is Drain Vitality. The level 3 effect is going to change from give all enemy creatures to give all enemy creatures in a lane -2/-2. This is one of the potential changes that I suggested in my 5 cards that could be nerfed video. And I think this is a pretty good change for it. It still keeps Drain Vitality very powerful. If you stack a lane against Drain Vitality, you're still going to get wiped more often than not. I just think that changing it to one lane, kind of focuses on how cool and unique the lane system is in Legends. So a lot of the time you hear top players saying, if you play anywhere other than the field lane, you're giving up your advantage, you suck, you're stupid. I like cards that make you have to think about your lane placement. So if you're coming up on turn 8 against a yellow deck, you know I should potentially start switching lanes since Dawn's Wrath is now online. And now the same will give you an opportunity to play around Drain Vitality. Because usually the normal counter to scout decks, originally it was tokens would just kind of beat these decks down. Drain Vitality completely just made tokens non-existent for the most part. And then just regular aggro decks usually will stack the field lane anyway. But now you have the option of trying to hide things in lanes so that you can't get completely wiped out with one card. A lot of people are saying Drain Vitality is dead now. I really don't agree at all. Drain Vitality is just going to go from a card that was good basically all the time. It was even good in Control Mirrors, which is just odd to have a card that's great against everything. So yes, the card is definitely worse. I 100% agree. But I don't think the card is absolutely dead. I just think that now it gives your opponent the ability to play around the card, and it gives Scout less of an auto win against aggro decks, which, with how greedy and slow the Scout deck we've become accustomed to is, I don't think it should have a near 100% win rate against other control decks and also still shut down other aggro decks. So this is the kind of nerf I was hoping to see on Drain Vitality. I don't want the card dead because there's too many dead shouts already, but just give your opponent the ability to play around the card. I still think a lot of hyper-competitive players will continue stacking one lane and they'll get blown out by Drain Vitality because they assume it's dead, and then they'll still kind of yell about it. But now, if you get Drain Vitality, it means you played into it. And if your opponent wants to save 2 level 3 Drain Vitalities and hit both lanes, you still have the potential to do that. So I like that. I think this was a pretty good nerf to it. But I guess I'll take... I was going to talk about this later for a different nerf, but I'll talk about it now. I still think one of the biggest things this game needs is better AoE. Now, I know you guys are going to probably question that, considering how much I've hated Drain Vitality. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the game needs better AoE. I just don't want broken AoE. So things like... I know this is a creature card, but like Cradle Crush Giant, for example. Deals 2 damage to everything in a lane. I think that's a pretty cool AoE card. It does great against other aggro decks. Obviously, turn 6 is sometimes tough to get to. But things like Cradle Crush Giant... honestly, Firestorm, I think, has been a good card since the game launched. Just nobody ever plays it. I don't know why. But I think Firestorm is decent if aggro sees an uptick. Things like Skaven Pyromancer are really cool. I mean, Grotwood Ambusher is a bad card, but I would like to see other effects like that. This game needs other AoE effects. Ice Storm is good, but obviously that's only available in blue. So giving other colors access to some cool AoE that isn't completely broken is something I think this game desperately needs moving forward. They're going to need to get a little creative with it. Things like the Chaurus Reaper effect, maybe on a creature that's a little bit cheaper costed. Maybe give like -1/-1 to one creature in each lane. I don't know. But stuff like that needs to exist. But we spent a lot of time on Drain Vitality, so let's move forward. The next card that got changed is Ulfric's Uprising. This was another card that I had on my list. Ulfric's Uprising is not really changing that much at all. It's going from 6 Magicka to 7. Obviously, one turn later is a nerf, so the card did get less good. But I think out of all of the nerfs, this card was affected the least bit. Mostly because the decks that are playing Ulfric's Uprising are pretty okay at turn 6 or 7 anyway, so I don't think the one turn is going to make that much of a difference for them. The infinite Magicka combos with Nixox and stuff like that may be slightly tougher to pull off now. But like I said, I don't think this card got much worse. I still think this card is really, really, really good. And it's still a card that I'm going to keep my eye on. I do like that it got nerfed, and I do think that Drain Vitality getting nerfed is going to be more of a nerf for this card. My reasoning for that is a lot of the decks that were running Ulfric's Uprising would normally lose to super aggressive decks and some mid-range decks, and Drain Vitality was allowing them to cheaply remove all those threats and survive to get Ulfric's Uprising played. So now that Drain Vitality isn't just going to completely wipe boards all the time, I would expect a lot of decks to have more trouble getting value out of Ulfric's Uprising. And I could see it potentially shifting from kind of a card that gets thrown in there as like a greed machine inside of green decks to potentially a bit of a win more card in some decks. I still think the card is really, really good. There's still going to be some decks that run this card and do very well with it. But just delaying that turn by 1 could give your opponent a chance to kind of remove some more creatures that they might not have been able to do otherwise. So this was the lightest of the nerfs in my opinion. But Ulfric's Uprising was always a card that I think was super dangerous. Wasn't completely broken yet, but it was broken in the current meta, in my opinion. Next card we're going to talk about is everyone's favorite aggro card. Haunted Manor. This is another change that I talked about in my nerfs video. The change for Haunted Manor is going to go from 3 to 4. So this is a pretty significant change for aggro. When I look at aggro cards, I always think of them with the ring in mind, because that's when aggro decks are shining the most in this game. So Haunted Manor, yes, it was a 3-cost card, but I always thought of it as this is coming down on turn 2, potentially. And very often, almost all the time for me, it did come down on turn 2 when I was playing as Hlaalu opponent. So, I mean, turn 2 they play this, turn 3 they play Hlaalu Oathman, and then they just start going crazy on turn 3. That was obviously incredibly powerful, incredibly dangerous. Now, Haunted Manor is 4 cost, which means it's coming down at best on turn 3, and often on turn 4. Turn 4 is around the time when a non-aggro deck that's playing against an aggro deck will start turning the tides of the battle if they're going to do it at all. So if I haven't already lost and turn 4 comes around, that's going to be the time when I start kind of successfully clearing the board and starting my comeback as a mid-range or even a control deck against these Hlaalu decks or other aggro decks. So forcing the Haunted Manor to be played on turn 4, which means if my opponent wants to play Haunted Manor, that means one of the most important turns in the game, they'll be playing a 4-cost, most of the time do nothing unless you have double Nord Firebrand in your hand. So it went from being a potential turn 2 bomb to just win the game, to now you have to really decide on turn 4. I mean, if you get it on turn 3, it's still really, really good. But now if you're playing it on turn 4, you have to decide, can I afford this tempo loss as my opponent's getting into their 5, 6, 7 cost cards? Is this something I can survive doing right now? Make no mistake though, Hlaalu is still an incredibly good aggro deck. There's still so much resource extension in that deck that I think it'll be able to do tons of damage, keep the hand full, and just keep going. It might not even need mana anymore. I still think they'll run mana as like a potential, like, if you can get it out on turn 3, drop it. But the deck is still going to be a really, really good aggro deck. I just think with mana being less of a auto slap it down and win play, maybe the power level will be brought in line. Hlaalu still needs to have an eye kept on it. But potential other decks becoming online from the mana nerf plus the Drain Vitality nerf could make Hlaalu less tempting. I don't know. It's something that I'm going to keep an eye on as well. I still think that Hlaalu's probably the most unique aggro deck we've ever had in this game, and it still could be just as strong without mana as it was with it. But now there's just going to be less of those turn 2 feel bad auto lose plays. But we'll have to keep an eye on that. So the next nerf we're going to talk about is Hand of Dagoth, and this was a bit of a surprise for me personally. Obviously, we all know Hand of Dagoth is an incredibly powerful card. 5 cost 5/5 with 3 of the best keywords in the game. Definitely my two favorite keywords in the game, and Breakthrough is just solid for aggressive mid-range decks. So it's getting its health dropped from 5 to 4. Things that affect that now is if you Rapid Shot Lightning Bolt, you can take out a Hand of Dagoth. If you just do anything to pop the ward, a lot of your 4 or 5 cost cards are now going to be able to trade into this thing pretty well. I don't know what the stats were on Hand of Dagoth. I'm assuming most of the time, if your opponent got one out on turn 4 with the ring and you didn't have insta removal like a Javelin or something, I assume that the win rate for those decks that got Hand of Dagoth on turn 4 and it didn't get removed, it was probably an incredibly high win rate. That would be my assumption. I don't have numbers to back that up. This wasn't on my radar of things that could be nerfed, just because we weren't seeing Dagoth that much. We were seeing mostly Scout Vani and Hlaalu. So maybe this was something where the developers had their eye on, once these nerfs come into play and Dagoth decks start seeing more play, this potential situation of turn 4 Hand of Dagoth would become much more common, so they wanted to preemptively nerf it. Maybe that's what they were thinking, I'm not really sure. I can see the thought process on the card. The card is still incredible. Even if this card had like 4/4 stats, I think it's really good with those keywords. But just the 5/5 was awesome. I don't really have too many thoughts on this nerf besides it was a little shocking. It does make the card easier to deal with, but still the card is an incredible card. I guess we'll see if we see more Dagoth moving forward. That would be my thought, is are we going to see more of this? And if so, then maybe that was a preemptive nerf for the future health of the meta. Next card we're going to talk about is Telva's Magister. This was another card I had on my list of cards that could be nerfed. And the nerf was exactly one of the nerfs that I suggested could be possibly done. Now it's being changed from at the end of your turn, if Telva's Magister has a ward, then you gain a ward. So more often than not, you're going to get at least one face ward with Telva's Magister. But now your opponent can just kind of firebolt Telva's Magister, pop the ward, and then you don't have to worry about that face ward getting dropped ever again. I think that's a key for this card was, A, this card has ward itself. So 5/4 with ward for 6 is already a really good card. It's going to probably at least 2-for-1 with your opponent's creatures, and in a mid-range mirror, or if you're playing an aggressive deck, any of these situations, Telva's Magister can 2-for-1, 3-for-1, if not more, and it's giving your face a ward continuously, so it's not like you can ignore the Telva's Magister and just try and go face a lot of the time, because that face ward is going to block a lot of key damage, especially in a mid-range deck where you're not really going wide as often, you're kind of just having a couple key threats on the board. So if I have 2 young mammoths, I can't just ignore Telva's Magister and lose out on that 4 damage every single turn. That's going to extend the game 2, 3, 4, 5 turns that it doesn't need to be extended. So now, with the nerf here, you have the option of just popping the ward and ignoring it if you're in that kind of race mentality. But at the same time, as the player playing Telva's Magister, these blue decks have so many different ways to reward creatures. If you're playing it in Battle Mage, you got the Battle Mace. Almost all blue decks are running Ward Crafter, so you could easily just pop the ward back on this thing. There are some decks that run lesser ward, it's not as common. But there are ways to get the ward back onto Telva's Magister if you want to re-enable that effect. So I think this was a very elegant nerf on this card. It still makes the card good. I could see a lot of decks winding up cutting this card though, just because how good it was before. It was an auto-include in anything, basically anything that wasn't a hyper aggressive deck running blue. Now I think you'll have to make some thought into whether Telva's Magister fits your deck strategy. So if you're playing a more aggressive mid-range deck, you may cut Telva's Magister in favor of something that's a little bit more impactful. But ideally that's what I want to see from a nerf, is keep the card good. Telva's Magister still good, keep the card good, but give the player at least either a way to play around the card, some more difficult decisions on whether or not they're going to run that card or not. I don't think any one card should be the right answer all the time. So I think that I really think they did a really good job with the Tel'Vos Magister nerf. Number 5, the final nerf we're going to talk about is Mudcrab Merchant. This card is changing from a 1-3 to a 1-2. The effect is staying the same. So a lot of the people who don't like Mudcrab Merchant don't like it because of the effect, not the stats. It's because of the effect, the RNG, kind of the wildness. You can't really control the card. You can't play around the card. And I agree, these kinds of RNG effects are kind of feel bad. But one of the things I've seen brought up on Reddit that I kind of agree with was, if there was no body on Mudcrab Merchant, if it was a one-cost action and it gave you a card and your opponent a card, a lot of decks are not going to run that card. Most people, I don't think, would ever run that card. So the biggest thing that had Mudcrab Merchant being run, especially in a lot of aggro decks, was it had excellent stats for a 1-drop, and it had this effect that was essentially a card draw for aggro decks. So now, with the stats being 1-2, Mudcrab Merchant trades with almost all 1-drops in the game. Will die to almost all of them. There's a lot of 1-drops or 2-1s. So it'll die to a lot of 1-drops, and basically any 2-drop in the game will kill Mudcrab Merchant. So I think that makes it much more doable. Because now, before, Mudcrab Merchant as a 1-3 would have this crazy RNG effect, and it could trade evenly over 2 turns with things like Wardcrafter. It could take out a lot of cards that it had no business taking out. So now I think with the much more doable health total, it'll make the card less appealing. I could still see it being run in a lot of very aggro decks, trying to kind of keep resources available. So I can still see it being run. It's just going to be not as stickable of a card. Because especially in like those aggro matchups, you play Mudcrab Merchant, almost nothing's trading into that 3 health, so it stays on the board. And then you drop something like Steel Scimitar or the Rally 1-3 thing, and that makes it way harder to remove, because now it's got 5-6 health, and that's on turn like 2. And then it just keeps swinging and swinging and swinging while you're playing other cards. It was a very snowbally bit of a 1-drop for aggro cards, or aggro decks. So I can agree with the health change. I still don't like the effect. I'm just the type of guy, I don't really like stuff like this. But if it's going to exist, I agree with the way that they went about nerfing it. Make it less appealing of a creature, to where you're playing it mostly for the ability, like an ability on a stick card instead of an ability on a good 1-drop card. So I'm fine with that. And last but not least, we got one buff. Duke Vidam Dren has gone from a 4-4 to a 4-5. We've seen this treatment before with things like Brynjolf. Brynjolf became way more playable after he got the 1 extra health. A lot of the balancing in this game is balanced around Lightning Bolt and Firebolt. So if a card dies to Firebolt or Lightning Bolt, it becomes way less awesome than if it were to survive those cards. So Duke being 5 health does make him way more playable. Not dying to Lightning Bolt or stuff like that definitely makes him more doable if any kind of mid-range or slower Halalu ever becomes a thing. It's not really a thing at the moment, although I do really like this card. I think the change that most people wanted to see was let Duke trigger on the turn you play him. So kind of similar to like Genius Pathmage, how Genius Pathmage you play a 6-drop, and even if you have 6 Magicka, it'll still pull and play a 0-drop from your deck if you have one. So Duke, if I play him on turn 5, it'll draw a 0-cost card, was the kind of change that people wanted to see. And I think that's a change I would have wanted to see as well, just because getting immediate value makes him more playable. But I guess I could see that where if you're top decking on turn 12, you play Duke, and then you automatically have a 7-drop to play, it could be a very swingy, kind of feel-bad type card. So just making him more survivable definitely makes him more appealing and more interesting, and I want to at least try him out. Now that he lives, I want to see if I can kind of get value out of him. Because if he's the kind of guy that you can get to stick around, then you can kind of start controlling the game, controlling which cards you're drawing, doing cool stuff like that. This was kind of an easy buff here. They didn't want to go too far, I guess, with changing the effect. There was a lot of text to change as well. So they just went for the easy, make it survive Lightning Bolt type buff. And I have no problem at all with that. So that's it, guys. Let me know what you guys think of all of these nerfs. What kind of decks you guys think will either become playable again or rise to the meta. How you think that the common decks that are playing all these cards, it's mostly Scout and Halalu, will be affected. Just let me know all your thoughts down below in the comment section. I think before Halalu and Scout Vani were on opposite sides of the spectrum of Halalu being hyper aggressive, more aggressive than most aggressive decks we've seen, and Scout Vani was slower than most of the slow decks we've ever seen. So we're on the opposite ends of the spectrum where nothing in between could really survive and win. So I think with those decks becoming less powerful, it opens the door for things like mid-range and tokens to come back into the game. So I'm excited and hopeful that that will be the case. Obviously, we will see once the buff goes live next week and the nerfs go live next week. But I am interested to see the next phase of Legends. But yeah, that's going to be it for now, guys. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments section. I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.